Thanks everybody for coming. My name's Cody. I'm on the board here. Just want to thank everybody for coming out to this event. I think this is going to be really awesome. Jared's going to read some great stuff. Follow us for more stuff, granvillearts.org. We've got an Eventbrite. We've always got events going on, really cool stuff. Everything free for everybody. Please come out and enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. A lot of clubs, a lot of workshops, and we've got a lot of stuff in the pipeline. So a lot of new stuff coming up. I think you guys all saw there's drinks out there. Feel free to grab something if you need to. And I think we'll just get started. So without further ado, here's Jared.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming. Some of you probably know me from social media, so social media can be such a placeless kind of space to inhabit. So nice to see actual faces and get to connect with folks. So sincerely appreciate you being here. So I'm going to read for 25 minutes-ish, and then we'll do a Q&A. So so save questions to the end, and I'll do my best to answer them. So we'll start with a poem I just wrote a couple weeks ago. And this was a poem I wrote for Atmos magazine, which is a cool publication. Do a lot about climate and ecology. And they came to me and said, "Hey, can you write something about death and renewal and nature?" And it's like, "Oh, you don't say." Like the main thing I do? Sure. So this poem is called Whale Fall. Sip tea by the morning glories. Taste leaf and light and steam, warm on unhurried lips, and think, this is our earth. But send one thought away. Send it on an errand, down deep to the whale fall. You know it's there, even now while you breathe air and fold your soft hands in sunlight. Where midnight is a place, they are building a cathedral in reverse, singing in the ribcage sanctuary, a slow hymn of tooth and claw, chewing the arches back to earth. Far from your teacup, in a boom and bust town of sleeper shark and spider crab, you will sense a homecoming hanging in the heavy dark, where one great heartbeat became many, became words scattered on sand. This is our earth. The whale is not here. The whale is not gone. Like her mother's milk, like your tea, your morning, the years before your birth, the ecosystems you are and the ones you will become. The mystery of it all is both the ghost that hunts the hall and the steam rising from your tea, bending with each sigh, intimate and out of reach. The ground knows what you suspect, that there is an unbroken path from where you sit to Leviathan bones. Feel it like a scar beneath your feet, leading down to where the whale called her congregation from black water. May it haunt without menace, not because it is powerless, but because it is yours to share. This is our earth. I love whale falls. If you've never looked at images of a whale fall or a video, I recommend it. It's sort of both ghostly and epic, and there's sort of architecture to it that I think is lovely to look at. And I always love thinking about the extremes of nature here on Earth that are also nature and are part of the same systems and order that we're all a part of. In that vein, this poem's called Woodland U. It's easy to look at the contours of a forest and feel a bone-deep love for nature. It's less easy to remember that the contours of your own body represent the exact same nature. The pathways of your mind, your dreams, dark and strange as sprouts curling beneath a flat rock. Your regret, bitter as the citrus rot of old cut grass. It's the same as the nature you make time to love, that you practice loving. The forest, the meadow, the sweeping arm of a galaxy, You are as natural as any postcard landscape and deserve the same love. I come back to that poem a lot for myself. I mean, as somebody who struggles with chronic major depression and am often looking for sort of the kindness and generosity in the world, I come back to the sort of effortless kindness I feel when I'm walking in the forest and think, okay, I know how to do this. I can apply that to myself. Cauldron. One day, your skull will be as empty as a conch shell on a fence post, full of wind and gentle quiet. Today, it's a cauldron of ghosts, flesh and electricity, water and memory, a machine that makes reality. Now, here, your skull is the garden where fact flowers into meaning. I do a lot of poems about death. Sometimes I don't realize it until for example, I'm trying to organize which poems I'm going to read for a poetry reading. It's like, geez, okay. I do live next to a beautiful cemetery that is also an arboretum. So I share a fence with it, and I often take walks there. So it's kind of a poem of a place, and it represents two of the main themes I write about. This is an excerpt from does anybody know my podcast? Okay, all right, okay. This next one is part of the text for the next episode for the podcast, so. Local color. When the wind blows, that old lantern sways on its hook, answering the crickets with the tuneless whine of fretting metal. That's when all the shadows bend and reach, haunting the old covered bridge, peeled paint breathing like a reef. There's nothing on the other side, thickets and thorn wounds, a dirt road too dead for weeds. Lighting the way is a paradox, somehow making us all less safe with the lie of no ability. Folks ask, who keeps that old lantern lit? I ask, who dare put it out? If you don't know my podcast, it's a character who does a sort of one-voice nature show about fictional nature. So I started doing that podcast because I wanted to focus on enthusiasm, and I sort of wanted to leave facts aside. So I sometimes call it real love letters for fake nature. And it's like, well, let's just leave the science to one side and lean into the love. So I mentioned earlier that I'm somebody who struggles with chronic depression, and that's certainly true. And I also have a rough time with seasonal depression. So November gets rough on me. And so this next poem is also a tactic that I use to think about my own struggles with mental illness. Shelter. Often, my mental health does not cooperate with my creative goals. Often, does not cooperate is an understatement. I frame this as brain weather. Sudden snow may disrupt my gardening plans, but the snow is not being malicious. It's not my enemy, it's just the weather. During my decades of storms, I have found that I can strengthen my shelters and sharpen my forecasts, but I still don't steer the clouds. I find this metaphor helpful. Natural hardships aren't punishments, nor do we own them. So we should not blame ourselves for our struggles to stay warm and dry. I have a buddy who read that poem and will now send me texts just asking how the weather is, which I find very sweet. That would be Alex. Alex is a guy I met in Delaware who sent me an email out of the blue and said, "Hey, I know this is weird, but I love your poetry, and I see that you're in Delaware, Ohio. Would you like to get coffee? I promise I'm not a murderer." And I ran it by my wife, and she was like, "Well," and then she kind of paused and was like, "You're not very kidnappable." It's kind of privilege. It worked out. Yeah, we're friends. You didn't murder. Flock. Humans are atom shepherds, tending our bodies, flocks of cells coaxed into action. One day, our sheep will go, and in pastures of flowers or stars, they will wear our gentle touches like ivy woven into their wool. Let them walk with our blessing to the green hills of ever after. This next poem I think of as a joke, or I did it first, but then my wife Leslie says that it's her favorite poem I wrote, so it gets added to the stack for that. The Big Bang. The universe is an ongoing explosion. That's where you live, in an explosion. Of course, we absolutely do not know what living is. We don't know what happens in the gulf between molecules and cells. Sometimes, atoms arranged in a certain way just get very, very haunted. That's us. When an explosion explodes hard enough, dust wakes up and thinks about itself, and then writes about it. I mean, it's true. Although since I live on the internet, people have been quick to explain to me that it's an expansion, not an explosion, technically. And I resist explaining to them what a metaphor is. I'm very nice. Simple. Moss is 300 million years old. At home on every continent, no deep roots, no towering trunks. Yet it tasted the air before the first feather, before shrews stirred the leaf litter. Moss doesn't race trees skyward, hunting for sunlight, and thrives just the same. When your mind hisses like a kettle, look to your elders, to the green lessons of soft, simple quiet beneath the sun. I love Moss. Spontaneous. Consciousness is a kind of music that one day the universe began humming to itself. We ask why, but we know the answer, because we have sung to empty kitchens while doing the dishes. There are kinds of silence that are pure potential, that are beauty demanding to be born. Living next to a cemetery does stuff too. One of my favorite of living next to a cemetery interactions I had was with my neighbor shortly after he moved in. We were chatting in the side yard, and a high school track team ran by in the cemetery. And he looked at me very seriously and said, "You can see them too, right?" Which is good living next to a cemetery. Fossil. The fossil is not the animal. The fossil is not the bones of the animal. The fossil is the stone's memory of the bones of the animal. And that's a poetry older than words. This next poem, I love this poem. And a fun fact about it is Patagonia contacted me and asked to license it for a t-shirt, which is cool. But I buy my shirts often in packs of 5. So I yelled out to my wife in her living room, it's like, "Is Patagonia a real brand?" And she was like, "Yep." Okay. Naming the river. The water in your body is just visiting. It was a thunderstorm a week ago. It will be an ocean soon enough. Most of your cells come and go like morning dew. We are more weather pattern than stone monument. Sunlight on mist, summer lightning. Your choices outweigh your substance. I like that idea for a few reasons. One is in reminding people how literally and fundamentally we are in conversation with nature on a physical, matter-of-fact level. And I also think that's important in terms of starting to wear down the boundary people feel between themselves and their lives and the natural world. I think facts like this are easy to overlook, so I'm always sort of hunting for the right way to phrase it to get people to ponder such things. Home. An ant crosses your carpet. A spider weaves a pattern older than mammals beneath your stairs. Just nod, breathe, and think, good. It's all still here. The forest, the mountains, the desert. At home in my home. The sterile white box is the stranger, not the ant, not the spider. This next poem is the poem I have most often received a note from somebody letting me know that they've incorporated this into a tattoo, which has happened a surprising number of times. Which is very cool. I totally approve. I have no idea what to respond to that. I can sign you. Clergy. Vultures are holy creatures, tending the dead, bowing low, bared head. Whispers to cold flesh, your old name is not your king. I rename you everything. This next poem, I have to get a running start at. It's the one most likely to make me cry. Bite. My son thinks he's seeing lightning bugs for the first time. He's only 4, and he doesn't remember last July. Don't try to grab them, I say. Hold your hand like this. We stand by the cemetery fence. I show him how to raise up his palm beneath them. A pink platform floating up through the dark. These are Big Dipper fireflies. They dip, they swoop. I draw a J in the air. So, we catch them from below. He lands one too hard and laughs. Gentle, don't grab them, just watch. The little beetle turns a half circle and flies off. Can I keep one? No. We don't keep. We only visit. Out across the cemetery, they are shining green and yellow on the graves. We are growing old. The earth, the nation, the village of ghosts I call myself. Do they bite dead? No, sweetheart. Not in the way you mean. Not in the way you mean. I'm almost close to home. Crisis. There's a bear circling. He's not your enemy. He doesn't hate you, but he will chew your naked throat if that's what the hour demands. We seldom admit the seductive comfort of hopelessness. It saves us from ambiguity. It has an answer for every question. There's just no point. Hope, on the other hand, is messy. It's a burning branch that stings our eyes. If it might all work out, then we have things to do. We must weather the possibility of happiness. There's a bear circling. He does not wish us harm. His stomach is empty but for heat and rising thunder. He's not in charge of our welfare. We are. That idea of rejecting hopelessness is one that is interesting, but I often get a lot of pushback on that idea online. Because I think people will try to shelter in the idea that they are leaning on sort of pragmatism or logic when they dedicate themselves fully to hopelessness. But I always contend that is an easy impulse, and it's one that we need to resist. Dying practice. Every memory is a ghost, and the house they haunt is you. 27-year-old me is gone from the world, but echoes of him remain. The same is true for 17-year-old me and 7-year-old me. Those people no longer exist, but I hear their footsteps in the attic. Humans are haunted houses. We are both the ruins and the ghosts in the shadows. We're pretty close to Halloween still. I'm just noticing a pattern. I do have poems about spring and stuff, I do. The chain. You were once very much part of your mother's body. The same is true for your mother and her mother, and so on back to the beginning. It's a biological chain that stretches back to the first living cell awakening in a young ocean, millions of years before the first spoken name. We are links in that chain. Can you feel its weight? A clear path back to ancient waters. You are here, in modernity, as familiar as thirst. Just remember what else you are. Your mother, her mother, the ancient seas beneath a thin, new sky. This next poem was the first poem that I posted on social media that kind of went viral. And suddenly it was like, oh, people are listening. That's a new feeling. It's a short one, which social media loves. The impossible. Bats can hear shapes. Plants can eat light. Bees can dance maps. We can hold all these ideas at once and feel both heavy and weightless with the absurd beauty of it all. I've adapted that poem into a children's book that I'm working with an illustrator in London. And it's close to being finished, so fingers crossed that might be out next year. Vulnerable. You are not safe. Your birth was reckless. Lightning strikes without reason. Countless simple mishaps may be fatal. To live is to collect risk, like a bee collects nectar. Yet, there is hope in fragility. Our goal was never safety. Our success is not measured in forever. Our years are seasoning, but the meal is meaning. Our task is to become our truest self and to smile at the knowledge that we will not succeed. This next one's about trees. Eavesdropping. Trees are the way we listen in on the conversation between cosmic energy and earthly matter. The sun posed a question. I didn't quite catch it. Something about hearing all motion as music. Something about galaxies stretching their joints after cramped quarters. something about vastness as a love language. Not all questions are made of words. Some are tides of heat and light. Some change the listener before they can answer. The earth took its time. Of course it did. A question as kind as sunlight deserves an answer as generous as trees. This is a good moving into winter poem. Orcas. Somewhere there are orcas. In my little gray house in Ohio, surrounded by the stale air of winter indoors. But somewhere there are orcas. It's an easy fact to forget. It's easy to shrink your world to what you can see. But thankfully, somewhere there are orcas. Sometimes my world is all sun-faded plastic, sprawled along the roadside in a scribble of petty meanness. But somewhere there are orcas. We all know facts that are as inert as chalk dust, but some knowledge is medicine. And this is the poem I'll close on. Forsythia. As forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It's not an age for towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers. Thank you. Questions, if anybody has any. Yeah?
Do you have a favorite poet or author that you like to read? It's a hard question.
That is a hard one.
Yeah.
I'm very seasonal, so it changes constantly, and it changes by the season. There are books I read every year almost. The Shining is a winter book. Moby Dick is an autumn book. And I have sort of a whole lot of things like that I think of as comfort food that sort of go along with my depression too, because there are times when I don't want something new. I want to kind of go somewhere where I know the neighborhood, if that makes sense.
Where all your friends are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I dodged that question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your process of getting an idea and then do you sit down and write then? Do you jot in a notebook? And how many drafts do you typically go through?
So most of the time I have a line or I have a question to myself. I got an email from myself this morning that I barely remembered writing that was just said, what if you encountered a spider web for the first time? Okay. I don't exactly know what I meant by that at 2 a.m. Typically I'll have the kernel of an idea that I want to communicate. I'm very much somebody who focuses on communication and the conversation I want to have with a theoretical audience or audience member, right? So there's something I mean, and there's something I want to say, and then from there it usually grows out where I want to find a point of contrast, so that in a poem I can locate some form of tension, which I think, like a harp string. I want that tension in the poem so that there's something to to strum. But rarely does a poem just kind of come to me. Something I want to say comes to me. And then the craft part is, okay, how do I wrestle with language until it's something that I'm comfortable calling a poem? And I mean, you'll notice if anybody has my poetry collections, I kind of say in the beginning, some of this is poetry, some of this is poetry adjacent. And, you know, I've come to feel that I'm okay with that. Because the conversation is really more important to me most of the time. Yeah.
When I'm reading your poems, I so frequently think of like a specific tree or a specific flower, or a specific body of water. And I'm curious if there are specific places that you would go to for inspiration or places you've been that struck you into these questions that you asked.
Yeah. Kinda. Probably not so directly. There are places I go that I kind of think of as medicine. And honestly, my wife will kick me out of the house if I have a certain look on my face. And then there's a handful of places that I go often. And then in those places, there are landmarks for me. Like, you know, I will make deals with myself when I'm having kind of a bad mental health day. And be like, all right, I'll get to the parking lot, and then I'll change the deal. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna walk to the shagbark hickory tree. And then I'll do that. And then I will tend to find that I feel better, but like, it's interesting, like, I would never be one of those people who are like, oh, the cure for depression is to go touch a tree. Do you know what I mean? But nature always has a certain effect when I'm feeling sort of down or depressed, where it doesn't make, it kind of changes the pain from something that I endure to more like a tile in the mosaic. It's one of the things I'm experiencing. And a lot of poetry arises from those encounters, but it's almost never one-to-one, you know? Like, getting out into anything that feels like connecting to the natural world is definitely part of like my core self-care kind of regime. So that kind of bleeds into everything I do, if that makes sense. Yeah.
When you were talking about how you're writing to an audience, do you sometimes feel like it's yourself
Oh,
that
absolutely.
you're communicating,
Yeah.
you're trying to communicate with?
Yeah. I mean, even if we go back to the mental health thing, like I'll have moments that I feel like are very strong, sort of lucid, happy moments. And then it's like, that's the time to put a note in a bottle and, you know, throw it in the water so I can find it later. And even like in terms of making meaning, you know, I often find that the meaning I care about is the meaning I have found a way to make myself. And so it's almost like I make this sort of canon or a set of tools that I can come back to. So I very much am talking to myself sometimes. But, you know, I bother to put it out there because I'm also talking to others, and that makes me feel connected to sort of the larger family of humanity as well as myself. Yeah.
Do you find yourself creating in a smaller form now so that you can post it, or do you just take excerpts and, you know, put it on social media? Like, does it affect how the form is, and do you have titles for everything that you've made?
No. So social media sometimes I call my internet chores, but it isn't a cynical thing for me. Like, one of the main things that keeps me writing is the feeling that like it's an act of service. And so that's why I don't just sit sort of silently for 2 years and then put out a book and then sit, like, I want to constantly have that interaction. So, you know, when I was saying that a poem comes from an idea, often what goes on social media is when I feel like I have a handle on the kernel of that idea. And then from there it usually expands because we have more room on the page, and that's what becomes the final poem. But the kernel, the idea, the thing I want to communicate is what usually becomes the social media post. else?
Best and worst thing about being on social media as an artist?
Oh. So I'm a pretty sensitive flower, you may have gotten. So it took me a while to kind of get the discipline of not treating everyone like they were a guest in my living room. So when somebody is like cruel or thoughtless or anything, I had to kind of make a new framework, a new metaphor for myself and think, okay, they're not a guest in my home, they're shouting at me from a car. So there's nothing wrong with just turning away. So, you know, I block and mute and stuff before anything can really get its hooks into me. I have to. The best things, I mean, I do it because there are a lot of best things, because I have a lot of conversations with people who either want to connect about the love of nature, or want to connect about a struggle with mental health, or want to connect over an idea, you know, or something that they want to tell me that they've struggled to articulate, that I articulated for them. And that's where that feeling of service comes in and keeps me writing. So, you know, I live on a little one-way street next to a cemetery. You know, if not for social media, like, there's a lot of things we can beat up on social media about, but the reason anybody has heard my work is because of social media. Anybody? Yeah.
How did you mentally, suffering from depression, how did you mentally make the hurdle to be visible?
I've had chronic major depression since I was 10, so I've been doing it for 30 years or something. And I also published my first poem when I was 10. I won a state poetry contest in Ohio. So I've kind of always done it. I had a really inspirational teacher in 5th grade who would send the students out to the woods, a place called the Land Lab, with pen and paper. I don't know if we could do that anymore really, but she's like, go out in the woods and write a poem and bring it back. And so I'm sort of lucky that I found it early as an outlet. Because one of the things about depression and certain aspects of mental illness is it's slippery. So like it's hard to pin down so that you can actually engage with it. And one thing practicing writing as a craft does is that it pins it down and it makes it tangible and finite, and then you can have a conversation with it. So there's a lot that I just found medicinal about the writing process. And in terms of putting myself out there, like if you're gonna bother to sharpen your tools for writing, like, you know, theoretically the main point is to communicate with other people and connect with other minds. So, yeah, I've been doing that a long time. And then for a long time I wrote more sort of academic poetry. And I would mostly submit to academic journals. And then there was a shift, maybe 5-10 years ago, where I started to be what I used to think of as belligerently accessible. Where I was like, no, I want to communicate with people. Like, I want to connect and express ideas. I don't want to write sort of more dense, you know, opaque kind of verse. So, and you know, for me, the way out of a lot of rough mental health spots are other people. Like, so that connection that writing brings has always been very important for me. Anybody else? Yeah.
So you interact a lot with people on social media. I happen to know that you have a fan in California because she bought me books and she has a set too. Have you heard from people like in other countries? What's the furthest away you talk to someone?
Yeah. I've heard from plenty of places on earth that can't physically get my books. Like India, a lot of fans in India. You know, so I've sort of made PDFs available, and I've tried to work with folks. And but you know, I got a message the other day that's just like, hey, you know, we have a poetry group in Melbourne, Australia, and just wanted you to know that you have a lot of fans here. Cool. So yeah, I mean, that's another good thing about social media, right? Yeah.
Just want to go back, does that teacher know how much they've influenced you?
Yeah, I reached out to her. And, She is very much not online. Aggressive. But I actually reached out through a friend of a friend in Newark. I grew up in Newark. Found her address, and so I've emailed her. I've sent letters back and forth and sent her copies of the books. And, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to new projects that maybe you're working on and what that process looks like for you?
Sure. So I have a nonfiction book coming out from Timber Press, which is with Hachette. Is it Hatchet or Hachette? Hatchet? Okay, I've always made that a soft C. I should know that, huh? But it's a memoir about what we've been talking about living with depression and how my connection with nature has sort of informed that struggle and given me kind of insight and strength and comfort. So that'll be out in autumn 2024. I have a third poetry collection that'll be out in a couple weeks. That's called Leaf Litter. And I'm thinking of it as sort of the third in the trilogy with Field Guide and Love Notes and Leaf Litter. With the thinking being that, like, you know, leaf litter in terms of like a lot of detritus piles up in your life, especially if you also have ADHD. So there are a lot of, like, you know, musical instruments under my bed and things like that. And it's the idea that leaf litter is, you know, just like leaf litter, it's producing soil, and that it's what fosters new growth, and that it's not waste, you know, old relationships or passions or career paths that you've abandoned. That all becomes the same leaf litter that encourages new soil and new growth. Yeah.
What is the percentage of things that you write versus what gets shown to the world? Be it finished or like poetic sketches?
22 point. I mean, look, I have a lot of half-written novels. I have an entire cryptonaturalist novel that I'm editing, that my agent is poking me to edit faster than I am. But in terms of poetry, honestly, if it doesn't pass muster to share with people, it kind of gets stuck in the mulch pile. That said, I keep the mulch pile, because sometimes there are days when I like stubbornly am like, no, like I don't feel like writing, but I'm getting something today. And I will dig through that mulch pile for a scrap of a line or an idea and be like, I'm doing something. Just sort of like to break the stagnation, if that makes sense. But most of it I put out there. I mean, I put stuff out there. That's kind of what I like about it. You know, I didn't publish a poetry collection until people bugged me to do it. Like, because I was just putting out poetry constantly, and a lot of folks started being like, I would like to hold this in my hands. Okay. And then I reached out to Jeff Vandermeer, is a novelist I really like and who I've chatted with online a number of times, and I was like, hey, I come from an academic background. I have like a major stigma against self-publishing, like with poetry, but like small poetry presses really aren't doing it for me. And he's like, stop it, just publish it. Like, okay, Jeff Vandermeer, I'll publish. And he was right. I mean, that was the way to do it with poetry. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned Jeff Vandermeer and Stephen King and Nathaniel Hawthorne, the things that you like. Are there podcasts or things like, because your Crypto Naturalist podcast is so delightful. Like, it just,
Thanks.
I listen to it on days when like I need something to make me happy and give me the thought that there is wonder in the world. And not the natural world isn't full of wonder, but it's nice to think that those little extra pieces are available too. So are there podcasts and things that you like to listen to?
Oh, sure. And honestly, I mean, you've hit on, that whole podcast is supposed to be a metaphor for what you felt about nature when you were a kid. Like, you could jump up and my son jumps up and down and is excited to see a bumblebee. So I go for cryptids because it's like, imagine you were encountering new nature. Like, just so that you can kind of recontextualize what the nature you actually encounter is. Welcome to Night Vale is a fun one for me. And then honestly, I put on a lot of podcasts just as company, Just like I want a pleasant conversation in the background. A lot of movie podcasts, Blank Check, The Flop House. I mean, comedy podcasts like My Brother and Me, which is just three weirdos chatting. I mean, it's an advice show, but it's not. It's bad advice. And usually I'll put that stuff on because, like, I often don't want crafted narrative. Like, you know, my podcast is scripted. It's just I write a 3,000 word short story and that's the podcast. But I find I actually have to listen to those more than I have to listen to a conversation, you know? So, yeah, I put on a lot of silly stuff. And Night Vale is a big inspiration for me. Yeah.
Do you ever look back at prior work and want to edit it, or do you edit it? Is there a finite time where you say that I'm not doing anything else with this? It's like cast in stone.
I'll edit it. I mean, you know, I like to think of these things as living documents, you know? But most of the time I'll come back to something old and think, okay, well, I've moved past this in one way or another, if that makes sense. If there's still a kernel of an idea that I want to communicate, then I'll resurrect it, but sometimes it'll be something completely new. And I mean, you may have noticed I come back to the same themes again and again, so, yeah. So if I liked language from something too, like, there have been lines in my life where it's like, okay, this line's going in something. I love this line. I'll decide what the thing that deserves it is when the time comes, but, but in terms of like killing my darlings, I do that all the time. Like I like to think I just have infinite ideas and writing in me, and so I don't have to worry that much about conserving any line I wrote. There'll always be more, and loving the process is so important to what writing for a long time means. That like you gotta kind of have blind faith in the idea that there will always be a new idea, so that you look forward and not backwards, I think. Thanks everybody. Okay.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Like, could you speak a little bit about, it seems like you're on Instagram a lot, like, is that your primary platform?
It is now.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so like, do you feel like that's gonna sustain you for a while? Do you feel like it's getting saturated as a space for poets? What do you feel is like the next place, or do you feel like you'll be comfortable there for a while?
Boy, you'd think I've thought about that, right? You know, I'm in this weird space right now where like the writing and the podcast started kind of making enough money where I quit my day job, and that shouldn't be true. So like I'm kind of just like, I'm sort of playing with house money right now, and at some point maybe I'll go back and have a day job. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, Twitter was my main thing for a long time. That's where I had the most followers, and now it's like a falling down haunted house, and I do not have the most followers there. And you know, it's I don't know. There will always be a place, a central place where I can connect with people and share what I'm doing. And so long as I continue, I think, to lean into the sincerity of that work, I don't worry that much about what the platform is, you know? It doesn't make any sense that most of my followers are on Instagram. I posted literally screenshots of tweets for 3 years. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, sometimes people are like, oh, how do you do Instagram? It's like, don't do it like me. It's like, my wife's a designer, and it's like I do screenshots of tweets. Like, yeah, so I have no idea. But I'm gonna keep putting myself out there. Yeah.
Can you speak to your process?
Which one?
In terms of like, do you write daily? Do you write the same time every day? Is there a certain period of time you need to sit or something? Do you meditate beforehand? Do you get inspired beforehand? Any kind of process?
My brain and my life are very inconsistent. So I write when I can, and then beyond that, I have to have some kind of discipline. Like I'd never finish a book if I didn't do a daily word goal or anything. If I tried to write just when I was inspired, you wouldn't hear from me. So I love it when I actually get an idea organically and get to do it. But I mean, I sort of jokingly said my internet chores earlier, but that's because it really is a part of my daily routine to answer messages and get some heavy messages sometimes, you know. And I try to just, you know, keep putting it out there, but I do try to think of it as a job, even though it's a bizarre job. So the process is often, I will forgive myself for the idea that I might not produce anything, but I have to get to the desk every day, if that makes sense. And it's just like when I said I made deals with myself when I was depressed to get out in the woods and said, I'll drive to the parking lot, I'll make it to the hickory tree. I'll do that with getting to my desk, getting a cup of coffee, and then, all right, now I'm gonna check social media messages. No, I'll open a document, even if, you know, just, but if you coach yourself along with those sorts of breadcrumbs, like, yeah, the final product, you'll get the final product and nobody has to know how you did it, you know? So, yeah, thank you. All right, well, I'm just gonna go right over there, so.